What if one of the largest, maybe the largest and most successful slave revolts in history just, well, vanished from the usual stories we hear?
Yeah, a conflict that seriously rocked a huge empire, fundamentally reshaped it even, but somehow remains, well, largely untold.
It sounds almost made up, doesn't it? But that's exactly what happened with the Zanj Rebellion.
It's this incredible conflict, raged for nearly 15 years, right there in 9th century Iraq, modern-day Iraq, from 869 to 883 CE.
15 years.
And you're absolutely right, despite its huge impact, I mean, monumental impact on the Abbasid Caliphate and the wider Islamic world at the time, it's just surprisingly obscure, especially in, standard Western history classes.
And that obscurity is exactly what we want to tackle today. This is the deep dive. And our mission here is to really get beneath the surface of this thing.
Yeah, to unpack all the complex layers, understand the real scale, the context, why did it happen then and there, and of course its lasting legacy.
We'll be using detailed historical analysis, looking at contemporary accounts though, as we'll see. We need to be super critical of those.
Oh, definitely, given the biases.
Absolutely. And we'll even bring in some pretty fascinating recent archaeological findings. Stuff that sheds new light on just the daily reality of that time.
It's so important to say this right up front. A lot of what we know comes from historians funded by the Abbasid state, the winners, essentially.
Right, like Al-Tabari.
Exactly. Al-Tabari is the main one. He was actually around for some of it. His history of the prophets and kings is incredibly detailed, invaluable, really. But, I mean, his perspective was completely hostile.
You can feel it when you read it, can't you?
Oh, yeah. He calls the rebellion's leader, Ali ibn Muhammad, things like the detestable one, the cursed one, just dripping with contempt.
So you can't just take it at face value.
Not at all. It means we have to read between the lines, constantly questioning, trying to separate the facts from the, official imperial spin. It's a challenge, definitely.
But it's a challenge worth taking on, right? To piece together a clearer picture.
Absolutely. So let's get into it, this forgotten giant of a conflict.
The scale. Let's just start with the sheer scale, because it's almost hard to wrap your head around. We're talking maybe 500,000 participants at its peak.
500,000. Just let that number sink in for a second. 500,000 people involved in this uprising.
It's staggering.
Yeah.
Compare that to Spartacus, probably the slave revolt everyone has heard of.
Right. Spartacus, maybe 120,000 people, lasted about 3 years, which is significant, don't get me wrong.
But the Zanj, 15 years?
Yeah.
Nearly 5 times as long, and potentially 4 times the number of people. It's arguably the biggest, longest slave revolt before, well, maybe Haiti.
Easily before the modern era, yeah. It's in a league of its own for its time.
And what makes it truly, truly fascinating for me, and really sets it apart, is that it wasn't just a chaotic riot. It evolved.
It absolutely did. It became what historians call a proto-state, or sometimes a maroon community, but on a massive scale.
They built their own capital city. They had a navy, a functioning navy.
And they even minted their own coins, their own currency.
That's incredible. So this wasn't just about running away, was it? It was about building something new, challenging the empire on its own terms.
Exactly. It was an attempt at creating an alternative society, an alternative power structure. That level of organization, that kind of state-building ambition from an uprising of enslaved people, it's exceptionally rare in history.
Most revolts like this, they flare up, maybe win a few skirmishes, but they get crushed relatively quickly, right?
Usually, yes. They tend to be localized, maybe reactive, often short-lived. The Zanj demonstrated this extraordinary capacity for sustained organization, administration, governance for over a decade.
Which brings us right back to that question. If it was so huge, so organized, so long-lasting, why is it so little known? You're probably sitting there wondering, why haven't I heard about this?
It's a fair question. And the contrast between its sheer scale and how obscure it is, especially in the West, is stark. We really need to dig into why that is.
And it's not like there aren't records. We mentioned Al-Tabari. He wrote pages and pages about it, sometimes based on eyewitness accounts.
Right, the documentation exists. The issue isn't a lack of sources. It's more about historical focus, historical bias.
You mean Eurocentrism?
Largely, yes. There's been this long-standing tendency in sort of popular Western history to really prioritize Greco-Roman narratives and then later the transatlantic slave trade.
So massive events in other parts of the world, even ones involving huge numbers of people and challenging powerful empires, just get sidelined.
Pretty much. They fall through the cracks of that dominant narrative. The Zanj Rebellion forces us, really, to confront that narrow, Eurocentric view of history, of resistance. It demands we broaden our scope.
It's a necessary correction, definitely. And understanding the Zanj also means understanding the empire they were fighting against. This wasn't just a random explosion.
Not at all. It was a profound symptom of imperial decay. The rebellion didn't happen in a vacuum. It erupted because the Abbasid Empire itself was in deep, deep trouble.
It hit right in the middle of this period called the Anarchy at Samarra. Sounds pretty chaotic.
It was. Roughly 861 to 870 CE. A decade of absolute political turmoil at the heart of the empire. We're talking assassinations of caliphs, depositions, constant power struggles.
Who's struggling against whom?
Primarily, it was between the caliphs themselves and their incredibly powerful Turkic slave soldiers, the Ghilman. These were meant to be loyal elite troops recruited from Central Asia.
But they got too powerful.
Way too powerful. Their commanders became kingmakers, basically, or caliph killers. Their rivalries and interventions led to this revolving door of weak or murdered rulers. The central government in Samarra, the capital at the time, was essentially paralyzed.
Wow, so the core was rotten.
Completely unstable, and this internal paralysis wasn't happening in isolation. The empire was also facing huge external pressures.
So enemies closing in.
Exactly. You had powerful rival dynasties cropping up. The Safavids were building their own empire in the east, pushing out from Persia, hugely ambitious and successful under their leader, Yaqub al-Safar. And then in the west, you had the Tulunids effectively breaking away, establishing near-independent rule in Egypt.
So the Abbasids were being squeezed from both sides while imploding internally.
Precisely. All this created a massive power vacuum. The caliphate was so distracted, militarily overstretched, fighting for its very survival on multiple fronts that it just couldn't mount a serious, sustained response to the Zanj Rebellion for almost 10 years after it started.
10 years. They just let it grow.
They tried a few half-hearted expeditions, but nothing major. They underestimated it, and frankly, they had bigger fires to put out elsewhere. The Zanj didn't just fight the Abbasids, they actively thrived because the empire was too weak and distracted to stop them early on.
Okay, so let's lay out a quick timeline just to give everyone a framework for what we're talking about. It kicks off at 869 CE.
Right. Ali ibn Muhammad begins the revolt near Basra, smack bang in the middle of that anarchy at Samarra period.
Then a huge turning point in 871 CE.
The Zanj capture and sack Basra, the main port city in the region. A devastating blow. Sends shockwaves.
But the empire doesn't really react strongly for years, not until 879 CE.
Exactly. 8 long years later. That's when the Abbasid regent, the caliph's brother, al-Muwaffaq, finally turns his full attention to the Zanj.
What changed?
The big thing was the death of that powerful Safarid leader, Yaqub, in the east. That freed up crucial Abbasid armies. Al-Muwaffaq could finally bring the empire's main military force to bear on the Zanj.
And that leads to the final phase.
Yes, from 881 to 883 CE. The long, brutal siege and the eventual fall of the Zanj capital, al-Muqtara. That's the basic arc.
Got it. So let's dig deeper now into those conditions in 9th century Iraq.
Yeah.
That crucible, as you called it. We've mentioned the anarchy at Samarra, but maybe we can unpack that a bit more. The consequences.
Sure, the chaos wasn't just about who sat on the throne. It had real, practical consequences across the empire. That constant infighting led to a serious loss of central control over the provinces.
Governors just started doing their own thing.
Pretty much. They saw the weakness in Samarra and thought, why send tax money there? They started acting like independent rulers, setting up their own little dynasties, keeping the revenue for themselves.
So the money stopped flowing to the capital.
Drastically reduced, which meant the central government couldn't pay its armies reliably, couldn't recruit new ones, couldn't fund major campaigns. It crippled the state's ability to project power.
And that explains why their early response to the Zanj was so weak.
Absolutely. They treated it like a minor local issue at first, sending small, ineffective forces. They just didn't have the resources or the political will initially to deal with what was rapidly becoming an existential threat right in their own backyard.
Okay, so the state is crumbling. What about the economic situation, particularly around Basra? You mentioned its wealth.
Basra was a major hub, a key port connecting the Islamic world to the Indian Ocean trade network, India, East Africa, even China. Huge wealth flowed through it. But that wealth, especially for the city's elite, was directly built on something incredibly brutal happening just outside the city.
The swamps. The Sawad, or Batiha.
Exactly. These vast marshlands south of Basra. The project there was land reclamation on an industrial scale.
What did that involve?
It involved scraping away these thick layers of salty, nitrate-heavy topsoil that had built up over time. Horrible, backbreaking work just to get down to the fertile alluvial soil underneath so they could grow crops like sugarcane and dates for profit.
And this wasn't a small operation.
No way. Our sources call it massively capitalized, unceasing. It required constant, grueling labor. And here's something amazing recent archaeology, like studies published around 2025.
Yeah.
They've actually found physical evidence confirming this. Excavations in southern Iraq have uncovered these huge man-made embankments, canals, massive earthworks dating precisely to this period. Tangible proof of the sheer scale of this operation.
Wow. So who was doing all this work?
This is where the Zanj come in. To fuel this massive project, thousands upon thousands of enslaved people were imported. Collectively called Zanj, it was a somewhat generic term for Black Africans, mainly from East Africa, brought across the Indian Ocean.
And they weren't working individually.
No, they were organized into enormous work gangs. We're talking groups of 500, sometimes up to 5,000 people, living and working together under the absolute worst conditions imaginable.
Describe those conditions.
Just picture it. Squalid, temporary camps in the middle of these marshes, crude shelters, minimal sanitation, exposed to the elements, disease. Their food rations were pitiful, maybe just some flour, semolina, dates, barely enough to keep them alive for the hard labor.
Now the treatment.
Utterly brutal. The overseers were notorious for their cruelty, beatings, starvation, summary executions for any perceived infraction, or just exhaustion. It was an environment of pure, grinding desperation and constant fear.
Now, you said earlier this kind of slavery was unusual for the time and place.
Yes, that's a really crucial point. This kind of large-scale industrial agricultural slavery was actually quite anomalous in the wider medieval Islamic world.
How so? What was more typical?
Elsewhere, slavery was more often domestic servants in households, or administrative roles, even high-level ones, or military slavery, like the Caliph's own Gilman. In those contexts, while still slavery, there were often closer, though still unequal, relationships between master and slave. Sometimes paths to freedom, manumission, even integration into society existed.
But the Zanj system was good.
Completely different. It was impersonal, industrialized, focused solely on maximizing agricultural output. The enslaved were treated not as individuals, but as interchangeable units of labor, cogs in a giant machine. There was little hope, little personal connection, just relentless exploitation.
And that sounds chillingly familiar, doesn't it? Like echoes of later plantation systems.
It really does. Historians like Popovich have made that exact comparison to the Americas. This uniquely brutal, dehumanizing system in the swamps was the absolute primary driver of the revolt.
It wasn't the first time they'd rebelled either, was it?
No, there had been earlier, smaller Zanj uprisings in the same region back in 689 and 694. It shows this wasn't a sudden thing. It was a deep-seated desperation that had boiled over before.
So there's a direct line. The wealth and golden age feel of cities like Basra was literally built on the backs of these people enduring these horrific conditions.
Absolutely. The prosperity of the urban elites was directly predicated on creating and maintaining this exceptionally exploitative system. So the revolt wasn't just against slavery in some abstract sense. It was a revolt against this specific brutal model of extractive capitalism driven by those elites.
And the landscape itself played a huge role too. The geography.
Critically important, marshes, Al-Batiya, this incredibly difficult environment.
How did it play a dual role?
Well, first, it intensified the suffering. Working in that heat, humidity, mud among insects and disease, it made the labor even more hellish and isolating. But paradoxically, that same harsh environment became their fortress.
A natural defense.
Exactly. Imagine this labyrinthine network of swamps, canals, waterways stretching for miles and miles, only navigable by small, flat-bottomed boats if you knew the routes. The climate was hostile, the terrain was treacherous reeds, mud, hidden channels.
So terrible for outsiders.
Terrible for the Abbasid army. Their soldiers were trained for conventional warfare, cavalry charges, infantry formations on open ground, all useless in the swamps. They couldn't maneuver, couldn't pursue rebels effectively. Their supply lines were constantly vulnerable. They got bogged down, literally.
But the Zanj knew it intimately.
They lived there. They worked there. They knew the hidden paths, the tides, the seasons. This gave them a massive asymmetric advantage. They could use the swamps for ambushes, for quick raids, to disappear. They turned the landscape of their oppression into their greatest military asset.
Which allowed them to hold out for so long against a supposedly mighty empire.
Precisely. For years, their knowledge of the terrain trumped the empire's numbers and equipment.
Okay, so you have this backdrop of imperial collapse, unimaginable exploitation, and a uniquely advantageous terrain. Then comes the figure who ignites it all. Ali ibn Muhammad.
The architect of the uprising, and he's a fascinating, somewhat enigmatic figure.
His origins are debated, right?
Yes, sources suggest he was Persian or Arab, but the key thing is he was not Zanj himself. He wasn't black, and he hadn't been enslaved in the swamps.
So an outsider. How did he connect with him?
Through a very clever political and religious strategy. His most crucial claim, the one that gave him immense legitimacy, was claiming descent from Ali ibn Abi Talib.
The Prophet Muhammad's son-in-law and cousin, hugely important figure in Islam, especially for Shia Muslims.
Exactly. Now, contemporary Abbasid historians scoffed at this claim, said it was fake. But for a suffering population, many harboring hopes for a messiah, a just leader from the Prophet's family, that claim was incredibly powerful. It offered hope, a sense of divine backing.
He sounds like a political operator even before this.
Oh, absolutely. His earlier career shows a clear pattern. He'd tried to stir up revolts elsewhere, like in Bahrain, over in eastern Arabia.
What was his approach there?
There, he adopted a purely Shi identity. It resonated with the population there. He gathered followers, even started collecting taxes in his own name. He knew how to read a situation and tailor his message.
So when he arrived near Basra in 869, he saw an opportunity.
A massive one. He astutely identified the Zanj, these thousands of desperate people, as a potential revolutionary force waiting for a catalyst. He didn't just show up. He actively inquired about their conditions, listened to their grievances.
And then made promises.
Big promises. Freedom, obviously, but also wealth, power, dignity, a complete reversal of their status. And crucially, he took immediate, visible action,
Like what?
publicly freeing some enslaved individuals, humiliating their overseers.
Yeah.
These weren't just symbolic acts, they were powerful demonstrations that he meant business, that he was on their side. It galvanized support incredibly quickly.
And his ideology wasn't purely Shi this time.
No, and this is where his real genius, his ideological flexibility, comes in. He kept the Alid lineage claim that connection to the Prophet's family because it tapped into those messianic hopes. But he deliberately downplayed exclusive Shi doctrines that might alienate others.
What did he incorporate instead?
He brilliantly blended in the radical egalitarianism of the Kharijites.
Kharijites, an early Islamic sect, right? Known for being quite uncompromising.
Very. And their core belief was revolutionary for the time. Leadership shouldn't be based on lineage, like the Shia believed, or tribal affiliation, like the Umayyads and Abbasids practice. It should be based purely on piety and capability.
Regardless of background.
Exactly. Their slogan was basically that the best person should lead, even if you were an Abyssinian slave. Imagine how powerfully that message resonated with the Zanj, who were literally enslaved Africans and other marginalized groups.
It directly challenged the existing social and racial hierarchy.
Fundamentally, it said their worth wasn't based on their birth or skin color, but on their faith and virtue. He also adopted Kharijite practices, like their specific call in Friday prayers.
He even used their symbols, didn't he?
Masterfully. He combined the green flag associated with the Alids and Shi'ism with the red flag used by the Kharijites. Green for messianic hope, red for revolutionary zeal and egalitarianism. He put Kharijite slogans on his banners, even on the coins he later minted.
So he built a broad church, ideologically speaking.
A very broad coalition. This hybrid ideology allowed him to unite not just the Zanj, but also local peasants suffering under Abbasid taxes, disgruntled Bedouin tribes who resented central control, freedmen, even some poor urban artisans. It was a movement of the dispossessed, brought together under this banner that offered something to almost everyone who felt marginalized.
Was he a true believer in all this, do you think? Or just pragmatic?
It's hard to say definitively, but the evidence points towards incredible pragmatism. He adapted his message based on the audience. In Bahrain, pure Shi'ism worked. Near Basra, with its diverse mix of suffering people, this Kharijite-Alid blend was politically brilliant. It suggests he understood the social and religious currents of the time extremely well and used ideology as a tool to build power.
Now, there's a really important, maybe uncomfortable nuance here about the promise of freedom.
Yes, absolutely crucial. He wasn't promising the abolition of slavery as an institution.
What was he promising then?
A reversal of fortune. He promised his followers, the enslaved Zanj, that they would become the masters. They were promised wealth, property, and significantly, their own slaves.
Wow. So freedom for them, but not necessarily for everyone.
Exactly. And we know that after the Zanj conquered cities like Basra, they did take captives. Some were likely enslaved, sold, or integrated into their own society in subservient roles.
That really complicates the narrative, doesn't it? from our modern perspective.
It does. It forces us to avoid anachronism. We can't just project modern abolitionist ideals onto a 9th century movement. Slavery was so deeply embedded in the worldview of that time across cultures that even a revolt by enslaved people might imagine freedom as becoming the enslaver rather than ending the system altogether.
It highlights how radical the Zanj were in challenging their own enslavement, but maybe also how pervasive the institution itself was.
Precisely. Their fight was for their liberation from a specific brutal form of oppression, but the framework of a slave-owning society might have remained imaginable, even desirable for some.
Okay, so from this complex ideological mix, born out of desperation, they launched their revolt. And it wasn't just riots. They achieved real military success for a decade.
Astonishing success, especially early on. Remember, they started with almost nothing. Farm tools, sticks, maybe a few swords shared among many. Sources even mention using kitchen plates of shields, trumpets to make noise and seem more numerous. Pure desperation and ingenuity.
But they learned quickly.
Very quickly. They became masters of guerrilla warfare in the swamps. Night raids were common and devastating. They built a fleet of those small, flat-bottomed boats, essential for moving around the canals. They used the terrain brilliantly.
And they started winning.
Yes, a string of victories against Abbasid forces who were just unprepared for that kind of fighting. They captured key towns like Olbula, Sukolawaz, cutting off supply routes to Basra.
And their numbers grew.
Rapidly. Success breeds success. More enslaved people flocked to their banner. Disaffected locals joined. Even some black soldiers from the caliph's own army defected to the Zanj side.
Which leads to the huge event, the sack of Basra in 871.
The pivotal moment of the early rebellion. They didn't just attack Basra, they blockaded it first. Cut off all food and supplies coming in via the rivers.
Starved them out.
Caused widespread famine inside the city. Then, in September 871, they launched a coordinated assault. The city's defenses, a small regular garrison plus some local militia, just collapsed.
And the aftermath was brutal.
Horrific, according to the contemporary accounts, which, remember, are hostile but likely reflect a grim reality. Widespread massacres, looting that went on for days, reports of indiscriminate killing men, women, children, torture of the wealthy to reveal hidden valuables, libraries burned, just utter devastation.
And Basra never really recovered.
Never fully regained its former status as the major trading hub. The sack was that destructive. It was the peak of the Zanji's destructive power, and it finally made the Abbasid government realize this wasn't just some local disturbance. This was an existential threat.
But even after that, the Zanj didn't just dissipate, they consolidated. They built a state.
Yes, this is the truly remarkable part. They established a functioning political entity that lasted over a decade. They built their own capital city.
Al-Qatara, the chosen city.
Right. Strategically placed on dry land within the swamps, heavily fortified with canals and earthworks. They even built a second fortified city, Al-Mania, the impregnable. This shows long-term planning.
And it had the features of a state.
Absolutely. They collected taxes, the courage from the lands they controlled. They maintained that crucial naval fleet. And, as we mentioned, the ultimate symbol of sovereignty, they minted their own gold coins, dinars.
And we have those coins today.
We do. There are Zanj dinars, minted at Al-Muqtara in 874, in places like the British Museum and the Paris Coin Cabinet. They bear Ali ibn Muhammad's name, Quranic verses, those Khurrijite slogans we talked about, tangible proof of their state-building ambition and their specific ideology.
It's just incredible to go from using farm tools to minting gold coins in your own capital city.
It shows this amazing evolution from spontaneous uprising to organized governance. They weren't just raiding anymore, they were administering territory, managing resources, projecting authority. It demonstrates real political and administrative sophistication.
And that war was fought, as you said, largely on the water.
Fundamentally, the War of the Waterways. The Zanji's mastery of that labyrinthine network, their boat-building skills, their amphibious tactics that gave them the edge for 10 years. The Abbasids kept sending land armies that got swallowed by the swamps.
So what finally changed? How did the empire strike back?
The turning point really was 879 CE.
Yeah.
For that first decade, the Abbasids were just too tied up. The internal chaos of Samarra, and critically, that huge threat from the Safavids in the east, they couldn't spare their main forces.
But then the Safavid leader died.
Yaqub al-Safar died in 879. Suddenly, the pressure in the east eased. This freed up the Abbasid Empire's best troops and its most capable commander, al-Muwaffaq.
The caliph's brother, the regent.
Yes, he was the de facto ruler, a really seasoned military man with strong loyalty from the elite Turkic army. He basically saved the Abbasid state, and now he could finally turn the empire's full, undivided attention and resources towards crushing the Zanj.
And his approach was different.
Completely different. No more small expeditions. This was going to be a war of annihilation. He organized a massive offensive. Huge numbers of soldiers, well-equipped, properly supplied. He even sent his own son, the future Caliph al-Mu'tadid, down there with a big army and fleet.
They finally learned how to fight in the swamps.
They adapted. They shifted from reactive responses to a systematic war of attrition. They built a large naval division specifically designed to operate on the canals, to challenge the Zanj boats, to cut their supply lines. They started destroying Zanj fortifications methodically.
So pushing them back slowly?
Exactly. A slow, grinding campaign, pushing the Zanj out of the territories they held, forcing them back towards their capital, al-Muqtara. It was relentless.
Which led to the final siege.
The epic siege of al-Muqtara. It began in February 881 and lasted for over 2 years.
2 years. That shows how strong the Zanj defenses were.
Absolutely. And it shows the Abbasids' commitment this time. They weren't going home until it was done. They actually built their own fortified city right across from al-Muqtara.
They built a whole city just for the siege.
Called al-Muwafaqiyah. It served as their long-term base of operations, housing thousands of soldiers, supplies, everything needed for a protracted siege.
And the fighting was intense.
Incredibly fierce. Street by street, building by building combat as the Abbasids pushed into the city. The Zanj defended every inch with incredible determination, even as they were being squeezed.
Until the end came.
August 883. Al-Muwafaq brought in reinforcements from Egypt, launched a final massive assault, and broke through the last defenses. The city fell.
And Ali ibn Muhammad?
Killed in the final battle. His head was cut off and sent back to Baghdad as proof of victory. That was the definitive end of the Zanj state.
Now, why did they ultimately lose? Was it just overwhelming force, or did they collapse internally?
Some sources mention hints of internal division or desertion towards the very end, which isn't surprising after years of brutal warfare and blockade. But the main reason, overwhelming force.
So it wasn't inherent weakness.
Not primarily. The Zanj had proven incredibly resilient and well-organized for 14 years. They defeated numerous Abbasid armies. They only fell when the full military and logistical might of the Abbasid state, led by its most effective general, was brought to bear on them relentlessly for years. The scale of that final campaign, the huge army, the purpose-built fleet, the siege city, the 2.5-year duration that tells you how formidable the Zanj were. They weren't beaten easily. They were crushed by the concentrated power of an empire finally able to focus.
And you mentioned logistics. That was key too.
Absolutely. The Abbasid victory was a logistical masterpiece as much as a military one. Sustaining that siege for over 2 years in that difficult swamp environment. Building al-Muwafaqiyah, keeping thousands of soldiers supplied, operating that large fleet. That required incredible organization, engineering, resource management. It was state power in action.
So the rebellion is crushed. What are the consequences, the legacy, the enduring scars?
The human cost, first and foremost, was just catastrophic. Modern scholars call it one of the bloodiest, most destructive rebellions in the history of the region, maybe West Asia as a whole. Death toll estimates are huge. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. Some even suggest over 1 million, though that's harder to verify. Just immense loss of life.
And the impact on the land. Southern Iraq.
Devastated. Irrigation systems destroyed or neglected, leading to more land becoming salty and unusable. Villages abandoned. Cities like Basra and Wasit plundered, depopulated. It triggered a long-term economic decline for the entire region.
Basra never came back to its former glory.
Not really. Its role as the prime trading hub diminished significantly after the sack and the subsequent turmoil. The whole region suffered economically for centuries.
What about the impact on the Abbasid Empire itself? They won, but at what cost?
A crippling cost. The war drained the imperial treasury. It consumed vast military resources. It led to a massive loss of prestige. And ultimately, it accelerated the empire's fragmentation.
How so?
By focusing all its energy and resources on crushing the Zanj in the south for years, the central government weakened its grip elsewhere. Other provinces continued to break away. While al-Muwafaq saved the core, the effort fatally weakened the empire in the long run. The victory was almost Pyrrhic. It hastened the decline of the caliphate into a more symbolic entity, with real power shifting to regional dynasties and military commanders.
Okay, so a devastating impact all around. What about the specific issue of that large-scale slavery in the swamps? Did it end after the revolt?
That's a major point of debate among historians. For a long time, the consensus was yes, the trauma and cost of the Zanj Rebellion were so immense that landowners basically abandoned that model of huge gangs of enslaved Africans for agricultural work. It was just too dangerous, too expensive.
Made sense. But you mentioned recent research challenging that.
Yes, fascinatingly, that 2025 archaeological study looking at agricultural mounds found evidence that large-scale earthwork construction continue in southern Iraq well into the 13th century.
Long after the Zanj.
Centuries after. Which suggests that maybe large-scale coerced labor, possibly still including enslaved Africans or other forms of indentured servitude, didn't completely disappear. Perhaps the economic imperatives just outweighed the risks eventually, or they found new ways to manage it. It's an ongoing discussion.
What happened to the Zanj survivors?
That's also murky. Al-Tabari implies mostly the leaders were executed. One interesting source claims al-Muwaffaq actually integrated many captured Zanj soldiers into his own army, rather than returning them to slavery.
Really? Why would he do that?
Possibly to avoid further unrest, or maybe just recognizing their fighting ability and incorporating them into the military structure, a common practice. Genetically, there isn't strong evidence of a large, distinct Zanj-descended population in Iraq today, suggesting maybe high mortality in the war or perhaps gradual assimilation over centuries.
Which brings us to how modern scholars try to understand the revolt's core nature. Was it about race? Was it about class?
That's the big debate, and the crucial point is that forcing it into one single box, race war, or class struggle, is probably anachronistic. The people involved likely didn't see these categories as separate in the way we might today.
So it was intertwined.
Absolutely. For the Zanj participants, their primary identity was brutally exploited agricultural slave. That's fundamentally a class position and economic status.
But we were also largely black Africans.
Exactly. In a society that already had racial prejudices and hierarchies, their blackness was inseparable from their enslaved status and the specific brutality they faced. So there was undeniably a racial dimension. They were targeted and dehumanized based on origin as well as labor status.
And the leader, Ali ibn Muhammad, used an ideology that appealed across lines.
Right. His blend of Kharijite egalitarianism, leadership for the most pious, even a slave, and Alid messianism, justice from the Prophet's family, deliberately aimed to unite people based on shared grievance and religious hope, cutting across specific ethnic or purely class lines. It was multidimensional. Economic exploitation, ethnic identity, religious ideology, all were tangled together.
Can you give us a quick sense of how different historians have emphasized different aspects?
Sure. Al-Tabari, the contemporary hostile source, saw it simply as heresy and rebellion against the rightful caliph. Simple as that for him.
Okay. What about modern scholars?
Alexander Popovich really emphasized the racial dimension, focusing on the unique conditions of Black African slavery there. Ghada Hashem Talami argued it was a broader social alliance, including peasants and others, not just a slave revolt.
So broadening the focus.
Exactly. Then you have someone like M.A. Shaban, who strongly argued it was primarily economic and class-based, and that focusing too much on race was imposing modern ideas backwards.
Interesting contrast.
And more recently, scholars like Nigel Furlong try to complicate that simple race war idea, looking at the complex mix of economic, political, and social factors, seeing it as a struggle for power and resources where race was one important factor, but not the only one.
It sounds like a really rich, complex history that resists easy labels.
Definitely. And it's not just academic history. The Zanj Rebellion echoes today. It comes up in discussions about the African diaspora, about resistance against slavery globally, and significantly for Afro-Iraqis today.
There's a community there tracing ancestry back.
Yes, particularly in and around Basra. They see themselves as descendants of people brought during that era, possibly including the Zanj, and sadly, they still face discrimination. For them, this history is very much alive and relevant to their ongoing struggles for recognition and rights.
A powerful reminder of how long these historical echoes can last.
Absolutely. So, wrapping up this deep dive, the Zanj Rebellion wasn't simple. It really was a perfect storm.
You needed that political collapse at the center, the anarchy at Samar, to create the opening.
You absolutely needed that specific, brutal, large-scale industrial slave system in the swamps to create the fuel, that mass desperation.
And you needed the spark. A leader like Ali ibn Muhammad, charismatic, politically savvy, able to craft that unifying ideology.
Without all those elements coming together at that specific time and place, it's hard to imagine something on this scale happening.
And its legacy is just as complex. A fight for freedom that, in some ways, aimed to perpetuate slavery by reversing the roles.
Led by an outsider, but fueled by the suffering of the enslaved, using an ideology that blended radical equality with claims of elite lineage.
Its success temporarily shattered an empire, but its ultimate defeat came from the overwhelming power of that same empire when it finally got its act together.
It's a story that really highlights the incredible resilience, the capacity for organization of people facing the absolute worst kinds of oppression. But it also shows the brutal realities of power and the deeply ingrained nature of institutions like slavery in that era.
It forces us to confront those uncomfortable truths, doesn't it? About power, freedom, who gets remembered, and maybe more importantly, who gets forgotten.
Precisely. Which leads to maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to take away.
The Zanj Rebellion is this massive event that largely faded from common knowledge. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other forgotten histories, what other stories lurking in the shadows of our standard narratives might hold keys to understanding where we are now, and maybe even shaping where we go next?
If this touched something in you, subscribe, comment, and share it forward. You're not just watching, you're part of this legacy.